31-year-old Ladian Logan from the Queens borough of New York City was arrested for crashing into a parked vehicle in Uniondale, a Nassau County hamlet. The accident occurred in the spring of 2017, and when police arrived at the scene, Logan became belligerent. The woman, who'd been driving drunk with her 6-year-old son in the car, started screaming and cursing at the officers. She was handcuffed after a brief struggle and led to the back of a police cruiser. Neither Logan nor her son was hurt in the crash. The woman was taken to jail while the boy was placed in the care of family members. True to her inebriated state at the time, Logan was wearing a "Support Your Local Bartender" tank top in her booking photo. She was charged with drunk driving, resisting arrest, and endangering the welfare of a child. Number 10. Matthew Davey. Just before 5 p.m. on October the 31st of 2016, British man Matthew Davey walked into a Santander bank in Cheadle in the Greater Manchester area. He passed the female teller a note claiming he had a gun and asking her to fill a bag with all the money from every counter. In the CCTV recorded raid, Davey wore gloves and a pair of multicolored Hawaiian shorts, but nothing to cover his face. The teller pressed the alarm and the shutter went down, forcing 35-year-old Davey to leave the bank empty-handed. A few days later, on November the 2nd, Davey went to an RBS bank also in Cheadle wearing the same shorts. He called a teller working behind the counter, but the worker was wary, having heard about the recent Santander incident. A prosecutor would later state that Davey mumbled something about having a bad day as he tried to put a charity box in his backpack. He was arrested later in the day. A judge considered that Davey's culpability was significantly reduced due to his poor mental health, which had been exacerbated by substance abuse. He was given a 2-year sentence, suspended for 2 years. Number 9. Claire Margaret Meacham. On the afternoon of October the 27th of 2022, the authorities in Mesa, Arizona, received calls about a possible drunk driver. The police arrested 23-year-old Claire Margaret Meacham and charged her with driving under the influence. As she was taken into custody, the woman told officers that she might have left her baby at home without any supervision. Law enforcement followed up on the report, and upon reaching Meacham's residence in East Mesa, they were reportedly able to hear her 5-year-old's cries from outside the home. Footage from the woman's doorbell camera indicated that she'd left the property at 12:44 p.m., which meant that she'd abandoned the child for over 2 hours until she was found by the police. The severely intoxicated woman claimed that she had no recollection of the events that followed after she'd left her baby in the crib. Records indicated that Meacham, who lived alone, had made no efforts to find someone to babysit prior to going out and drinking during the day. Fortunately, the child was unharmed and was subsequently placed in the care of a relative. In addition to the DUI charge, Meacham was also charged with child abuse. Yet, in spite of her disturbing actions, she was seen displaying a wide smile in her mugshot. Number 8. Nagathran K Dharmalingam. In April of 2009, Malaysian man Nagathran K Dharmalingam was caught entering Singapore with a bundle of heroin strapped to his thigh. Following the discovery of the package, which reportedly contained approximately 1.5 ounces, 21-year-old Nagathran was sentenced to death by hanging, in line with the country's zero-tolerance policy on drug possession beyond a certain quantity. The young man gave several statements regarding his crime. In one of them, he said that he needed money for his father's heart surgery and to pay off his debts. In another, Nagathran maintained that he'd smuggled the drugs under duress as a Chinese man whom he called King had assaulted him and threatened to kill his girlfriend. Nagathran later stated that he didn't know what was inside the package. His execution was put on hold due to a countrywide moratorium on capital punishment. Nagathran was assessed by an expert and determined to have an IQ of 69, a level recognized as indicating intellectual disability. His case attracted international attention from various activists and human rights organizations who asked the Singaporean government to commute his sentence to life imprisonment. The argument was that Nagathran lacked the intellectual capacity to understand the full weight of the consequences his actions would have. The international criticism was also aimed at the country's policy of executing prisoners for drug offenses, a policy which the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights described as incompatible with international human rights law. In spite of the multitude of pleas and appeals, the Singaporean government determined that Nagathran had known what he was doing and found no merit in arguments stating differently. Roughly 13 years after his arrest on April the 27th of 2022, Nagathran was hanged at Shanghai prison. Number 7. Richard Ford. British man Richard Ford was serving a 30-month sentence at HMP Nottingham for knife possession in early 2016. In January, he passed a series of notes to his prison officers, threatening to kill several members of prison staff, a fellow inmate, a district judge, a police officer, and a former partner. He threatened to abuse their corpses and added crude drawings depicting his intentions. The following December, a judge at Lincoln Crown Court considered that the 39-year-old was highly dangerous and gave him a 45-year sentence. Ford's defense appealed the decision, offering several arguments, including the man's extraordinarily low IQ, as well as him having mixed motives for issuing the threats. Ford had spent most of the past 14 years in prison, and his defense argued that he'd become institutionalized and had committed various crimes in order to remain in jail. In one incident, after he'd been released, the man had called the emergency services claiming he was a danger to others. Ford won his appeal in 2018 as Sir Brian Levison deemed that his original sentence was disproportionate for a man who never actually assaulted or attempted to assault anyone. Ford's actions would nevertheless still result in considerable jail time. His sentence was reduced to 12 years with parole eligibility in 8, and with an added 8 years on license. Number 6. Marvin Lee Wilson. Texas man Marvin Lee Wilson was put on death row on May the 9th of 1994. In November of 1992, he and another man, Andrew Lewis, kidnapped 21-year-old police informant Jerry Williams. Wilson had discovered that the latter was talking to the cops, which had led to them seizing 24 grams of cocaine from his apartment. Williams was found naked on the side of the road, severely beaten and fatally shot in the head and neck. Lewis was given a life sentence, while Wilson, who was determined to have been the gunman, was sentenced to death. The Supreme Court ruled in 2002 that the execution of the mentally impaired was outlawed, but left it to states to determine what constituted mental impairment. Experts measured Wilson's IQ at 61, meaning he was legally ineligible for execution. He unsuccessfully appealed his sentence on that basis. Edward Marshall, a Texas Assistant Attorney General, claimed that Wilson had displayed a functional degree of personal independence and that he was evidently able to manage money as demonstrated by his drug-dealing, street gambler criminal lifestyle since an early age. Moreover, Marshall argued that Wilson had demonstrated being capable of manipulation and inventiveness, drive, and leadership in orchestrating Williams' murder. 54-year-old Wilson's execution was carried out on August the 7th of 2012. He was pronounced dead at the state prison in Huntsville 14 minutes after his lethal injection had been administered. Number 5. Beaufort James Penley. North Carolina man Beaufort James Penley was charged with first-degree murder following the 2017 death of Joshua Christopher Stebbins in Asheville. The body of 46-year-old Stebbins was found on June the 29th behind a gas station. He was severely bludgeoned, having suffered fatal blunt force trauma to the head and body. Penley was arrested the following day. As the legal proceedings into the matter progressed, multiple psychologists, including one working for the DA's office, found the man incapable to proceed and beyond restoration. One expert reported Penley's IQ to be 65, well below the average limit of 100. The medical consensus was that Penley suffered cognitive dysfunction, including apathy, lack of insight, paucity of thoughts, communication deficits, and impaired memory. The murder charges were dropped on May the 13th of 2020 without prejudice to refile, meaning that Penley may be charged again should he regain the ability to proceed. In the aftermath, he was taken to Brofton State Hospital in Morganton for inpatient commitment. Number 4. Anthony Natali. In the summer of 2022, Australian man Anthony Natali was given a minimum of 10 years and 3 months in Melbourne's County Court for taking part in a massive drug smuggling operation. Natali, a pizza chef at La Porchetta restaurant in Melbourne, had helped in the distribution of over 660 pounds of cocaine which had been smuggled to Australia from Papua New Guinea via a Cessna plane. The shipment was reported to have contained other drugs including MDMA and methamphetamine. In the aftermath of its arrival, multiple law enforcement departments teamed up to crack down on the syndicate. They monitored their movements and operations through wiretaps, physical surveillance, and intercepting phone communication. Natali, who was in his late 20s, was observed transporting large shipments and laundering a total of over $2 million. In October of 2018, he handed $200,000 to an undercover agent posing as a money launderer. Roughly 5 months later, he repeated the process with another officer, giving him $385,000. Law enforcement also learned that Natali had moved close to $1.5 million between Keysborough and Ascot Vale in early 2019. He was ultimately arrested at his Ascot Vale home in July of 2020. Before handing out the sentence, the judge accepted that the man simply did the bidding of the crime syndicate and acknowledged that he wasn't a mastermind. The judge was quoted as blaming low intelligence and immaturity for Natali's actions. Number 3. Zachary Morgan. In 2017, the Vanderburgh County Sheriff's Office in Indiana investigated threats made against a law enforcement officer, accompanied by threats to blow up Central High School. The troubling messages had been posted directly through the We Tip hotline, and investigators linked the user's email to 18-year-old Zachary Morgan. At the time, he had an active harassment case which had been opened the previous month. Morgan was tracked down by officers and agreed to speak to them without an attorney present. He reportedly confessed to having been behind the school bombing threats. He was arrested and preliminarily charged with intimidation and false reporting. Morgan's mother told the court during a probable cause hearing that he had a very low IQ and didn't understand the ramifications of his actions. After hearing her arguments, Vanderburgh County Circuit Court Senior Judge Carl Helt agreed to release the teen on his own recognizance. One of the conditions was that he was banned from going to Central High School. Number 2. Brandy Chilton. Law enforcement in Pine Knoll Shores, North Carolina was called to a hotel in the summer of 2020, whereupon they encountered 40-year-old Brandy Chilton. The intoxicated woman had been asked to return to her room multiple times, but refused to do so and was causing a disturbance. She remained combative throughout her interaction with the authorities and reportedly screamed profanities at them. After being taken to Carteret Health Center to be medically cleared, the woman was processed at the local jail. She was inebriated to such an extent that an officer had to hold her up for her mugshot to be taken. The end result was the woman looking disheveled and barely able to keep her eyes open while displaying a wide grin. After number 1, we have our previous video of when thugs go wrong lined up for you. Stay tuned if you need a bit of higher daily, they will kill you dosage still. Number 1. Sarah Wilson. In July of 2014, officers in Fayetteville, Arkansas, responded to a call at an address in the 2700 block of North Arroyo Road. The caller, 21-year-old Sarah Wilson, reported that she needed medical attention because she'd been in a fight with her 2 roommates, a man and a woman. Wilson told responding law enforcement that the former had gotten on top of her and began hitting her in the face. The police observed that Wilson had a swollen eye and bruises to her forehead. The woman admitted to having picked up a whiskey bottle but claimed that she didn't remember striking the man with it. However, further interviews with the female roommate revealed that Wilson, who'd been living with her for 6 months, had not only started the fight but had struck the man with the whiskey bottle, inflicting a large cut on his head. The roommates reportedly asked Wilson to leave, and she subsequently called the police from a neighbor's house, a course of action that backfired since she was the one who ended up being arrested. Wilson was taken to Washington County Detention Center and faced the charge of 3rd-degree domestic battery. Number 8. Santo, Lasoya, and Jose Martinez. 2 men were arrested in March of 2017 for a fatal drive-by shooting that had occurred a year prior in a Chicago neighborhood. On December the 16th of 2016, after attending a Chicago Bulls game, Crispin Collis went to a Dunning convenience store with a few friends. The 28-year-old exchanged words with Santo, Lasoya, and Jose Martinez, members of the Milwaukee Kings street gang. Both men had matching face tattoos marking their affiliations and reportedly asked Collis about his gang connections. A mandate of the Kings, as reported by the authorities, was to kill their rivals or perceived rivals on sight. Collis and his companions ignored the thugs who briefly left the scene. Lasoya and Martinez retrieved firearms from a nearby stash house and then returned in a white Jeep. They pulled up to Collis's car and fired at least 4 shots into it. Collis was hit in the temple and later pronounced dead at Lutheran General Hospital the day before his 29th birthday. As reported by prosecutors in the case that followed, Lasoya and Martinez later got the logo from the Douce liquor bottle they'd purchased that night tattooed below their eyes to commemorate the murder. The car they'd used in the drive-by was traced back to them, and both men pleaded guilty to the killing. Lasoya was sentenced to nearly 33 years in federal prison, while Martinez, who also pleaded guilty to racketeering charges, was given a 29-year term. Number 7. Noel Reed. By October of 2020, teenager Noel Reed from Winsford, England, had begun to act upon his ambition of setting up a drug operation in the area. Nicknamed the Devil, he and his crew had become connected with criminal elements, looking to become Winsford's main suppliers. Then, on October the 11th, Reed and several accomplices started looking for 2 men whom they'd suspected of trying to take over their racket. They spotted their targets in the town's Premier store. The victims desperately clung to the front door as Reed brandished a Rambo 3 hunting knife, and one of his accomplices started smashing through the glass with a hammer. The 2 men fled through the stockroom door, but after Reed and the others regrouped, they confronted several of their rivals' friends, including 27-year-old former Army cadet Keegan Crimes. Even though the latter wasn't known to be involved in criminal activity, Reed attacked him, inflicting devastating knife wounds. Crimes died after losing roughly 33 pints of blood. 2 other men were non-fatally stabbed as they tried to intervene and swipe at the teenage crime boss with a branch. One eyewitness reported of Reed that he was trying to stab everyone in his sight, like a man possessed trying to kill anyone. After fleeing the scene, Reed later sarcastically posted on Facebook, "R.I.P. Keegan." Within weeks of the murder, as the police still searched for the perpetrator, Reed and his crew carried out a violent house burglary. During it, he'd held a mother and son at knife point, threatening to cut them up. DNA evidence eventually tied him to Crimes' killing, while the teen's Google searches revealed phrases such as "does blood wash off shoes?", Rambo 3 knives, and guns. By the time he was discovered, Reed had buried the murder weapon and it wasn't retrieved. He was ordered to serve a minimum of 19 years for the killing and showed little emotion as the sentence was read out. Reed did, however, make gang signs and blow kisses to his friends in the public gallery. 2 other teenagers connected to the incident had been given 12-month youth referral orders at an earlier hearing after they'd admitted a fray. Number 6. Jamie Davison. In July of 2020, British teenager Coral Edgar invited Lee McKnight, with whom she'd once been involved, to her home in Carlisle, Cumbria, with the promise of intimate relations. Unbeknownst to 26-year-old McKnight, Edgar had been doing the bidding of dealer Jamie Davison. McKnight owed him several £1,000s and had gone into hiding, but Davison used Edgar to lure him out. He recruited Aaron Graham and teenager Jamie Lee Roberts to help him and ambushed McKnight when he arrived at the address. The man was tied to a chair and beaten to the brink of death for roughly 2 hours. He was punched, kicked, stomped, and struck repeatedly with a diamante-headed riding crop. Davison and his accomplices then dumped his body into River Caldu using a cart provided by Edgar's mother. It was also determined that Roberts' father had taken fresh clothing to the blood-splattered house and torched evidence associated with the incident. All 6 people involved in the killing of McKnight were convicted of murder in 2021. Davis, whom one of his fellow accused characterized as a psychopath, was sentenced to at least 30 years behind bars. Number 5. Young Thug. Grammy Award-winning rapper Jeffrey Lamar Williams, professionally known as Young Thug, was denied bail for a third time in August of 2022 in a case relating to his alleged gang activity, as well as several other charges. On May the 9th, Williams was arrested in Atlanta, Georgia as one of 28 people charged in a 56-count Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. All the defendants were associated with the Young Stoner Life Records, founded by Williams in 2016. Aside from the RICO charge, a raid of Williams's Buckhead home resulted in 6 further felony charges for the possession of several firearms, including a machine gun and the violation of the Georgia Controlled Substances Act. Arguing against Williams's bail release, the prosecution described him and his associates as the real deal, as well as violent, dangerous people who'd been connected to numerous murders. They also pointed to Williams's rap lyrics in which he'd identified himself as the gang's general. Number 4. Daniel Masalek and Camille Nessayak. On November the 28th of 2015, Daniel Masalek and Camille Nessayak attacked a 27-year-old man with an aluminium baseball bat and then forced him into a taxi into the former's home in Netherton, Merseyside, England. Over the course of 9 hours, the man was subjected to degrading torture by Lasoya and Masalek, whose numerous face tattoos included the words "Thug Life" below his mouth. It involved forcing the victim to perform intimate acts on them, urinating on him, inserting objects into his body, repeated beatings, and locking him in a small storage cupboard. Masalek's 27-year-old fiancée, Orna Basak, filmed roughly 90 minutes of the man's ordeal on her cell phone. They made him confess he'd had inappropriate relations with minors, which, albeit untrue, the victim did, hoping it would end his torment. He then heard the others leave while he was locked in the cupboard. The victim kicked the doors open, got dressed, and made his escape by jumping from a window. Masalek, Lasoya, and Basak were arrested in the aftermath and sentenced at Liverpool Crown Court in 2016. Masalek was jailed for life with a minimum of 9 years served, his fiancée for 12 years, and Lasoya for 18 years. Number 3. Michael Lynn Rogers. In 2016, Michael Lynn Rogers was the second in command for the North Texas branch of the notorious Aryan Brotherhood gang. In July of that year, the man known as Texas Mike gruesomely murdered 34-year-old Alberto Gonzalez at his Dallas home. The latter wasn't affiliated with the white supremacist gang and had reportedly gone to Rogers' address to buy illicit substances. AB affiliates Gregory Collier and John Paul Street were also present in the home. At one point, Rogers accused Gonzalez of stealing a wallet containing $600 from him. It marked the beginning of a ruthless and horrific assault on the man. He was struck with a hammer, slashed with a machete, burned with a hot spoon, and had a broom handle inserted in his body. Rogers then used a power tool to drill 4 holes into the man's skull and 2 more into his chest and abdomen. Gonzalez's body was dumped at a remote pond near Irving, Texas, and set on fire. The 3 men were arrested, and Rogers initially tried to pin the murder on the other 2, but Collier and his girlfriend testified against him. For his cooperation, Collier received a 10-year sentence for a reduced kidnapping charge, while Rogers was sentenced to life without parole. Details of Gonzalez's killing troubled the jurors, who asked whether their name would be made public prior to delivering a verdict. As reported by Dallas Morning News, over 15 officers were dispatched to the courtroom to ensure the jurors would leave safely. Number 2. Marella Ponce. Following her arrest in October of 2017, Marella Ponce earned considerable attention on social media, with many users referring to her as a hot felon. 20-year-old Ponce, who was affiliated with the Tiny Rascal gang, had been arrested by law enforcement in Fresno, California, following a traffic stop. The young mother was in the car with her baby, 2 fellow gang members, and 2 firearms which had been reported stolen. She was charged with carrying a concealed firearm and carrying a stolen firearm, both of which were felonies. Fresno police shared Ponce's mugshot online, as well as a photo of the lilac handgun found in her possession. Visible from the processing photo were Ponce's multiple neck and chest tattoos, one of which read, "Love is pain," while another, "Pain is pleasure." The mother of two's bail was set at $50,000 for each count, and many within her newfound following offered to pay her bail or advocated for her release, much like with Jeremy Meeks, a felon who'd become a social media sensation a few years prior. The arrest provided an opportunity for Ponce to turn her mugshot into a successful modeling career. Number 1. Bryce Rhodes. On May the 22nd of 2016, Kentucky brothers Maurice Gordon and Larry Ordway were stabbed to death by a gang leader who'd initially tried to recruit them. Local rapper Bryce "Rambo" Rhodes was among the 4 people charged with the double homicide. Rhodes was also charged with the shooting death of 40-year-old Christopher Jones on May the 4th. Teenagers Gordon and Ordway reportedly looked up to Rhodes, who'd sold them on the idea of fame and the street gangster lifestyle. He took them shopping for designer clothes and featured them holding guns in his rap videos. On May the 4th, Rhodes spotted Jones while driving through Louisville with the brothers and 2 other teenagers. He mistook Jones for a local gangster who had a price on his head. Thinking he'd collect on the hit, 25-year-old Rhodes jumped out of the car and gunned down the innocent man. Gordon and Ordway witnessed the killing and were left terrified of Rhodes, who later began fearing that they'd go to the police. A few weeks later, he invited them to his home under the guise of partying. He eventually accused the brothers of stealing from him, which was believed to have been a pretext to kill them. After a brief scuffle, he bound and separated them, as reported by another teenager present at the scene, who'd later become Rhodes' co-defendant. He made Gordon get on his knees and beg for forgiveness. Once he'd done so, Rhodes put a stocking over his head, gagged him, and stabbed him multiple times in the chest. He then knifed Ordway to death as well. Their bodies were found burned and dumped behind an abandoned house. The murder was traced back to Rhodes, who subsequently pleaded not guilty. His 3 co-defendants all took plea deals that, in at least one case, involved giving evidence against him. The trial was repeatedly delayed, but the hearings were marked by several instances of troubling behavior on Rhodes' part. One in 2016 involved him threatening the presiding judge and her family, while in 2018, he laughed at the murdered teen's mother, prompting her to lunge at him and be escorted out of the courtroom. His constant disruptive attitude towards the authorities caused him at one point to be brought into court wearing a spit mask.
He made Maurice on his knees and beg for forgiveness. And he put a toboggan over his head, and he put a rag in his mouth. And then he stabbed him. We moved Maurice to the side, and we brought his brother, and we put the toboggan over his head. He put the toboggan over his head and put the sock in his mouth. Sorry, stabbed him too.
Thanks for watching. Would you rather be the smartest person in the world or the most physically fit? Let us know in the comment section below.